Good morning to everyone present today, this panel, this morning session. I'm very happy to have this full panelists, great panelists today to discuss on the crisis of representative democracies in the European Union. The reason is in order to be focused more on the functioning of the European Union, all the challenges that the European has faced and is facing. And for that reason, we have great speakers today. And the first is Professor Jonathan White, professor at MC, who has just published a very great book, In the Long Run, The Future of as a Political Idea, where he's have this great account on the historical development of the concept of democracy, but also the challenges of democracy and representative democracy at the moment. There is also a very nice explanation of how some of these historical moments, like the Cold War example, also are triggering the development of this idea in the contemporary context and in the context of the European Union. Of course, this is not the only great book from Jonathan White. It's also Politics of Last Resort, Government Emergency in the European Union, where he developed the concept of emergency politics, together also jointly then used with his colleagues that we have in this panel. So without further ado, I will invite you to have you.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. And I presume I'm audible to those online. So I'm going to talk briefly under the heading of democracy in an age of emergencies. I don't have any slides, so you get my bodily presence, but you don't get anything else apart from my words. So let me say very briefly what I'm going to be talking about structurally. I'll talk a little bit about emergency politics as a kind of background condition almost of contemporary politics and contemporary democratic politics. I'll talk briefly about two challenges, particularly to representative democracy. In other words, I think this is the panel where representative democracy is an organizing term. And it seems to me that in this age of emergencies, as we might describe it, one gets at least two challenges to democracy, two family of challenges, one which we might call challenges to the democracy component, and on the other hand, challenges to the representative component, so two challenges to representative democracy, and then I'll conclude by saying something about what we might make of those challenges. So, to start off then, an age of emergencies, but I guess that's a kind of banal thought these days, but maybe the element to append to it, an age of emergencies, but also of competing emergency claims. We're very used to thinking, to reading off the top of our head a whole range of contemporary problems that seem to have achieved the status of urgency, of a pressing threat that requires some type of response in the name of necessity. But of course, what's interesting at the same time is that people don't necessarily agree on what are the key emergencies or the key emergency of the present. To put it very simply, one might perhaps say that there are left-wing emergencies in the present to do with climate change, economic inequality, certain aspects of contemporary geopolitics. I say left-wing not in the sense that they should be of significance only to those of a particular political orientation, but they tend to be politicized, especially from the left. You could say the same about right-wing emergencies to do with migration, exercise of state power, fears of replacement and so on in a racial sense. Perhaps you could even make a claim that this is an age of centrist emergencies as well, whether those are to do with AI or the unmaking of the rules-based order as it tends to be described in international terms. So much of contemporary politics seems to be played out in the register of emergency, and yet without clear convergence on which emergency. Why all this talk about emergencies? Well, as I try and argue in that book, which Amy just mentioned before, in the long run, there are, of course, many reasons why one might see the present as being characterized by this proliferation of emergency politics. It's perhaps got something to do with the material pressures afflicting contemporary societies, whether that's to do with climate, to do with concentrations of wealth, or indeed to do with the biological factors, pandemics. There's clearly a material aspect to everything that throws up this atmosphere of emergency. There's clearly something to do with the world, the public sphere, of the media, of the sense in which a media climate perhaps encourages only the most extreme formulations to be heard in contemporary politics as a way to get heard, the attention economy, and so on. But the claim that I tried to develop further in the book is that this is also very much a reflection of what we might call a sense of powerlessness in contemporary societies. The thought being that things become an emergency when you feel powerless to address them. I think that applies in part to governing officials, to those in power, aware that they have lost the allegiance of those whose allegiance they might have counted on in the past. Think of the weakening of political parties, reliance on institutions that are somehow perhaps felt to be unable to deal with some of those material pressures that I just mentioned, weakened by debt, outsourcing, and so on. So doubtful of their capacity to mobilize followers, doubtful of their capacity to bring the powers of the state to bear, often seeking in ideas of emergency a way of not just convincing the populations to accept their authority, but also finding ways to coordinate across multiple sites of authority. The European Union perhaps being a particularly interesting case where that felt sense of powerlessness is perhaps amplified by the separation of powers across so many different institutional sites at the national level, the supranational level, the political, and the technocratic. So a sense of emergency that comes with the felt weakness of representatives, a sense of emergencies that I think also comes from the felt weakness of those outside institutions who look on at a world of governance characterized increasingly by the concentration of decision-making authority, executive centralization, secrecy, and so on. And those who talk the language of a climate emergency, I would say, are exactly using the discourse of emergency out of a sense of the imperviousness of elected power, of technocratic power, to respond to concerns other than those of those in charge, the sort of self-referentiality, if you like, of contemporary policy making. So in that sense, a sense of powerlessness inspiring emergency politics from those outside institutions, looking on at those inside institutions who themselves may also be reaching for this register of politics out of a sense of the diffusion of power, the weakness of their instruments of policy. So an age of emergencies, an age of the proliferation of emergency claims to do with, as I would say, a sense of the impotence before problems that, if one could be confident in one's capacity to address them, they wouldn't be emergencies. Climate change, I think, is emblematic here. It's not that we have no sense of what should be done in response to it. It's not as though the problem is fundamentally mysterious. It's a problem of agency, of the capacity to mobilize opinion. In this atmosphere of emergencies, it seems to me that representative democracy comes under challenge from at least two broad bodies of critique, and as I anticipated them before, one you might think of as a challenge to the democracy part of representative democracy, another you might think of the challenge to the representative part of representative democracy. The challenge to democracy, of course, I think is a familiar one, skepticism in various forms and degrees towards policy being responsive to public opinion. So a desire to concentrate power in some kind of elite, whether in the Eurozone crisis of the 2010s, that's the elite of European institutions, and I would say also elites within the elites, those at the top of European institutions, the formation of networks that straddle institutional power within the European Union that link the head of the ECB, circles within the Commission, and so on. And I would say this type of concentration of power often it's surely done in the name of a general interest, but not done in the name of listening to public opinion. It's, I think, often a sense that democracy should play second fiddle under moments of extreme pressure, and clearly during the Eurozone crisis you get explicit statements to this effect. So a challenge to democracy in the sense of a challenge to the perceived relevance of heeding public opinion, popular will, as a guide under conditions of urgency. I've described that so far mainly as a position coming from, if you like, the elites of political institutions, but I think you also see a faint echo of it amongst movements from below, some of which, probably not most of which, but some of which are equally sceptical of the relevance of public opinion in an age of emergencies. Think of the vanguardism of certain climate movements, which I would say focus rather on trying to change prices, rather on trying to change state policy directly, rather than via the medium of trying to change public opinion itself. So, for example, Ende Gelände, I think in Germany, might fit some of this. There are plenty of climate movements I'll come to in a moment for whom this is not true, for whom it is all about trying to shift public opinion. But I think there was certainly a strand here which is also a challenge to, if you like, the relevance of democracy, at least in an interim phase. Perhaps not a principled critique of democracy, but a sense that democracy should be secondary in the face of certain emergencies. So that's what you might say a family of critiques of democracy in conditions of emergency. On the other hand, I think you have a family of critiques which are a critique of the representative part, but perhaps in the name of democracy. A critique of representative democracy, but not of democracy itself. Less a critique of public opinion than of the procedures and representative institutions by which it is channeled. Calls for direct democracy, for the circumvention of institutions and procedures in the name of bypassing the corrupted and blocked channels of mediation, allowing public opinion to speak more directly. This, by contrast, I think is often a position articulated, if you like, from below. So advocates of street-level direct democracy, councils, assemblies, whether it's Extinction Rebellion, Occupy, before it, I think have this character of being critiques of representation without necessarily being critiques of democracy at all, in the name of democracy. But then you might also say there's something of the same from above in certain movements that we call populism, which perhaps are also exactly a critique of the representative aspect of democracy in the name of another notion of democracy. And, you know, the Trumpian disdain for electoral results, for institutions of deliberation, of separation of powers within the US Republic would be perhaps exactly an example of this type of critique of representation from above. So, an age of competing emergency claims gives rise to difficult times for representative democracy, where some people would say the problem is democracy itself, and some people would say the problem is representation itself. But we need to have forms of democracy that are non-representative. As I try to argue in this book, I think we need to be wary of both of these types of critique. We tend to think of representative democracy as a kind of second best form of democracy, perhaps because we rather quickly equate it with the existing structures of liberal democracy that seem to be fading before our eyes. But it seems to me there's something important about representative democracy which is prone to get lost in this type of atmosphere I'm describing. The problem with democracy skepticism perhaps is the one that's most easy for us to identify. What counts as an emergency and what counts as a viable response to an emergency clearly depends on what you value, what you want to hold on to in the status quo. And these things are clearly things about which there can be plenty of reasonable disagreement. The danger when you take the anti-democratic position is clearly that you become heavily dependent on the discretion of the powerful few, and especially vulnerable to special interests or private preferences. Actions will tend to reflect their priorities in ways which are hard to contest. I think that's true, for example, of Israel-Palestine at the moment, where marches on the streets remind us that public opinion does not speak with one voice on this issue, and indeed that elites of existing institutions may be very far from what might count as majority public opinion. But I think it's also true of something like climate change, where environmental pressures in no sense determine what trade-offs need to be made in response to the pressures of the moment. What kind of society one wants to build in the context of material pressures is something about which there is plenty of democracy to be had. So the problem with democracy skepticism, if you like, is it tends to present emergencies as though they were simply brute material facts of an external world, when of course they are always that relationship between material factors and what we want to prioritize. And there are different priorities and disagreements to be had amongst that. Hence, it seems to me, neither on intrinsic grounds nor on prudential grounds does it make sense to go down the route of democracy skepticism. Of course, the problem with representation skepticism, by contrast, is that while it may well take public opinion very seriously, the attempt to bypass institutions of representation, of procedure and so on, can be self-cancelling. It can result in a very localist form of politics. I think that may be true of some of the street-level experiences of the 2010s, but also a very transient form of politics. This book that I refer to is about future-making politics and questions of short-termism, long-termism. I think there is a sense in which the attempt to bypass representation is often associated with a kind of a form of a scattering of politics. The problem of creating a cause that accumulates over time as opposed to a series of flashes of political will. And it's exactly that capacity to build a cumulative cause, which I think is quite distinctive of representative democracy and of the party structures that we have tended to associate with it. And of course, the danger of efforts to sidestep representation is that it can be worse than nothing. It gives a democratic facade of what ultimately perhaps is still the power play of interests. So I think we should be wary of these challenges to representative democracy that emerge in this context of emergencies. At the same time, of course, the status quo is simply no answer here, because it's partly responsible for that sense of powerlessness, which I believe is behind so much of contemporary emergency politics. There are clearly no easy responses to what this might then point to, but forms of intensified representative democracy are what I ultimately end up arguing for in this book. In other words, ways of working with the idea of representation, of institutions of mediation, which I think are actually a first best rather than second best aspect of democracy, but thinking about how to intensify them, whether that's to do with the agents of representation, to do with parties, inter-party democracy, movements forming parties, contesting electoral institutions, and so on, or whether it's the extension of representative democracy to where it's been absent. And in some of my work, I talk about the European Union in exactly this context. I think one of the problems of the EU is not only that it has a tendency to emergency politics, but to the elevation of a particular set of concerns as a kind of hegemonic emergency, the dominant emergency of the day, whether that's in economics in the 2010s, whether it's in geopolitics at the moment, where I think precisely one of the concerns we may have going into this election year is the way that a certain geopolitical conflict has become the hegemonic emergency of European politics. So, to sum up what I'm saying, these kind of political problems of representative democracy, I think, are at the very centre of this age of emergencies, that we cannot simply think in terms of external pressures to do with environment, economy, and so on. I think those are all entirely real, but they acquire the status of emergency in their relationship to institutions and the felt experience of institutions as being unable to rise to the challenge. And normatively, I think we need to not lose sight of the value of representative democracy, much as it is critiqued in these conditions. There is something important about both the element of representation as well as the element of democracy. I'll stop that one.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for touching on so important topics and perspectives in a very short time. And I'm sure that the audience will have questions afterwards. I would like to just reflect briefly on your arguments, and one thing that certainly comes on the surface is the use of the emergency politics related also or justified to the need of some secrecy. But in a democratic society and a democratic political system, this sort of justifications of the use of emergency secrecy is and should be regulated by constitution. So with that on mind and how this is legally justified or not in the context of the European Union, and also in terms of institutions, and also in concrete environment, like when Stefan will also reflect on the war of Ukraine, I would also like to invite now Mike Wilkinson, who did reflect in his book on the need of this institutional reflection, how to reflect on the institution, but also legally, in legal terms of in the constitutional, on the constitution of the European Union as well. And in his book, Authoritarian Liberalism, and he also developed this concept and the transformation of the modern Europe. He also reflects on how the European Union has been developing since the post-1945 era. What sort of factors have contributed for the European Union to act in sort of way, whether or not it will justify some of the politics that we are currently witnessing, and something you have also identified in your own work. So with that in mind, I would like to ask Mike to reflect on his topic, and his topic for today is the end of the history and the project of the European integration. So, Mike.
Thanks very much, Emilija. Can I just check that you can hear me?
Yeah.
Great. So, yeah, thanks, Emilija and Julia and Ellie for the invitation to this project. And I'm very sorry I can't be there in person, hopefully next time. But it's a pleasure and a privilege to be invited to talk in this group and on this particular topic. The title of my talk is The End of History and the Project of European Integration. And I have some slides, but just very briefly, I'll give you a quick condensed version of the thesis, which is that contrary to Fukuyama's famous claim that the end of the Cold War signaled the end of history, my claim in this talk is that it signaled the end of history. In other words, a rebirth of politics of sorts, in which the European integration plays a highly, let's say, constraining role on democratic representative politics. And I will conclude by going so far as reflecting on the title of this panel, Risks to Representative Democracy in the European Union, by highlighting the risk of the European Union itself, the risk that the EU poses to representative democracy. So first, let me see if I can move to the next slide. In my narrative, the end of history moment is more appositely captured by the post-war era itself. And this wonderful picture of Alexander Kojev, the Russian-born French philosopher who adapted Hegelianism for the 20th century, captures this end of history moment. In fact, Fukuyama himself realizes this, but without realizing it. And this is a quote from the afterword to the second edition of The End of History and the Last Man. In line with Kojev, I argued that the European project was in fact a house built as a home for the last man who would emerge at the end of history. The European dream, most fully felt in Germany, is to transcend national sovereignty, power politics, and the kinds of struggles that make military power necessary. This post-war period unfolds over the decades in between, let's say, the Treaty of Rome and the Treaty of Maastricht, in a way that produces what I call in my book a form of soft or passive authoritarian liberalism. And this is marked by a number of features: a gradual demobilization of mass politics, a sense of a freedom, a Cold War liberal freedom in which the individual exercises freedom from politics, in other words, in the sphere of consumption, the official abandonment of class struggle, in which social democratic parties gradually refute class struggle and Marxist revolutionary socialism, and more generally a narrowing of the political spectrum to lead to this end of ideology, as Daniel Bell famously puts it in his article on the exhaustion of political ideas in the 50s. So a lot of what is often associated with neoliberalism, in my view, has to be traced back to this earlier moment. In fact, in my book, I suggest that it needs to be traced back to the interwar period, but I don't have time to go into that. It has various dimensions: the constitutional dimension, captured by the order liberal belief in constraining democracy in order to protect the free market. It also has various ideological dimensions, captured by the Frankfurt School theorists, but again, I don't have time to go into that. Maybe we can come to it. What I would like to highlight is that this feature of post-war democracy, its highly constrained aspect, was captured by theorists at the time. Franz Neumann, in his diagnosis in the 50s, talks about political alienation as increasing in Europe at a tremendous speed. And I want to highlight that the role of European integration here, although certainly not necessarily at the root of this alienation, reinforces it. It consolidates this constellation of authoritarian liberalism. In EU studies, classically, this period is referred to as a period of permissive consensus. Of course, as the lawyers know, there was a lot of activity in the European court, largely tucked away from public view. But we also can trace the slow decline of parliamentary democracy, the slow decline of representative democracy throughout this period. Now, if that is correct, then the moment that Fukuyama believes signals the end of history is, on the contrary, the end of history. It's a new beginning. It's a new beginning in a variety of ways. Now, this is a complex picture, and again, I can't do it justice in the time available, but I want to point to certain continuities as well as discontinuities in this moment, this era, the Maastricht era, which I believe we are still in the thralls of, as it were. And we have, on the one hand, a continuous trajectory in light of the project of integration itself, upscaling into economic and monetary union, the constraints on economic policy that Maastricht poses, and a tightly constrained central bank are in many ways a continuation of a mix, let's say, of ordo and neoliberal ideas by now, which have become largely hegemonic. You have what Peter Meyer famously described as an increasing void between rulers and ruled, which is exacerbated by the democratic deficit of the European Union. But again, Meyer's thesis could very well be seen as an extension of what Kirchheimer had already diagnosed in the 1960s. So there's continuities here in terms of what I call a soft authoritarian liberalism. But there are also discontinuities, which is why this period can be seen to have given also a renewed impetus across the political spectrum. And it's important to note that this occurs on the right and on the left and on the centre, as Jonathan noted in his own way. And we have the growing popularity of the National Front in France, let's say an authoritarian populism avant la lettre. We mustn't forget, of course, as well, Austria in the early 2000s. The systemic challenges to this mode of constrained democracy also emerge through the German Constitutional Court in Karlsruhe on the bottom right picture, signaling a disconnect or a discontent with the constitutional designs of the European Court of Justice. And of course, significantly, considering the title of this project, the expansion, the geopolitical expansion of Europe with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the promise that the democratic promise that offers, but which I think is highly curtailed. So there are let's say alternatives and disconnect and discontent and certain restarting of the narrative, but that the processes in which that is expressed are, let's say, not fulfilled. Now, this signal should have been there from an early stage. The French vote in the 1990s on the Maastricht Treaty, the famous Petit Oui, when the French voted 51 to 49% on ratification of Maastricht, should have sounded the alarm bells. And in fact, it did sound the alarm bells. And if we look back at some of the figures, some of the perhaps less well-known figures in the era, this is Marcel Gauchet, a more recent picture, but in the 1990s, Marcel Gauchet, the French philosopher, talked about a social fracture that was emerging in part, in his view, due to the collapse of the French Communist Party, the turn of the working class to right-wing nationalism, and indeed the culpability, the responsibility of the project of European integration in entrenching this, what he calls, wall between the elites and the people. So it was diagnosed at the time. Now, what is, I think, interesting to note in terms of this disconnect is that many of the European left intellectual elites put their faith almost fully in this project of European integration. This is Jürgen Habermas on his 90th birthday, not in the bourgeois public sphere, but in his rather bourgeois-looking living room, talks about the EU as a stepping stone to the constitution of a world society, in the context of a growing mismatch between, to use his own terminology, system and life world, aggravated by ideas of post-nationalism, post-sovereignty, post-politics, and post-democracy that were common at the time. But there was this cognitive dissonance in that these same philosophers like Jürgen Habermas would diagnose with acuity the democratic deficits of the EU. Now, sorry, I just wanted to say something briefly about enlargement. I haven't got the time to go into this in detail. It, I think, nicely highlights, in fact, in intense form, this combination of neoliberal shock therapy plus low-intensity democracy that scholars like David Kennedy identified in the 1990s. Jan Zielonka adds this dimension, which I think is increasingly significant now, of the EU in this period looking increasingly like an empire or exhibiting imperial forms in terms of its extension of power, at the same time as having a highly formalized view of democracy as enshrined in this legal form in Article 2, which is now being utilized in certain ways by the European Commission. In the last decade and a half now, it seems like a long time in a way since the outbreak of the global financial crisis, but we've faced this long conjunction, unfinished conjuncture, a series of polycrises, as Adam Tooze calls it. We can discuss the Euro crisis, the rule of law crisis, the recent pandemic, now the war in Ukraine, and various attempts to fill the void that Maya discussed, both in technocratic form, as signaled by the extension of the European Central Bank's powers through the crisis response, in terms of the emergence of left and right populism, now to the extent where the EU itself is looking increasingly like a home for far-right politics to take hold of the reins, and indeed emulated in certain ways by the European elites, as in their discussions of the European way of life and the signals of Fortress Europe that represents. Now, I've only got a couple of minutes, so I want to say briefly why this end of the end of history remains in such a deferred state. And there are, I think, two things to talk about. One is the absence of a hegemonic stabilizer. And again, this could be looked for in various guises, both in terms of the technocratic stabilization that was prominent in the era of Draghi and Merkel, the attempt at a left-wing populist stabilization in the guise of Yanis Varoufakis and DPM. Increasingly now, it looks as if people are reaching out to the identification of an enemy. This is the idea of Putin and Russia's Putin as providing the cement for the identification of the other enemy outside, perhaps under the auspices, or certainly under the auspices of a US-led NATO. None of these will, I believe, respond to the challenge that Jonathan so rightly, I think, posed at the end, which is to a renewal of democratic representation. And in fact, in each of these guises, there is, I think, a deepening authoritarianism, latent or even evident. And I would like just to quote Spanish intellectual Luis Sanchez Cedillo in a Jacobin article last year, when he says the militaristic response of the EU to Russia's invasion of Ukraine has reduced the probability of a truly reformist path in the EU to almost nil. So, what is the antidote? What is the answer? And again, I think Jonathan nailed it at the end. It's a renewal of democratic representation. Now, of course, this is easier said than done. And I think in my own assessment, my own diagnosis, in keeping with the spirit of this paper, is that the demobilization of the demos, that is integral to the project of European integration, based on this ideological or even now civilizational Europeanism. And I'm thinking in that guise, for example, of Hans Kunani's recent work on Euro-whiteness. But the antidote to that is a repoliticization of the demos through projects of democratic sovereignty, which must, in the final analysis, be international and not Eurocentric. And that is my conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike, as well, for reflecting on so many important topics of the contemporary context where all these crises are handled, short-term or long-term, as also Jonathan has mentioned. And with that in mind, then we will discuss later when we reflect on your presentation in the questions session. But I would also like to reflect on, briefly before I introduce the third speaker, Professor Stefan Auer. Thank you very much for joining us from Hong Kong with this time difference. Stefan is not only coming from Slovakia, but he's also quite well expert on European sovereignty, working on the topic for a very long time, and now in his recent work he's also reflecting on the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the politics of emergency in Europe, combining his previous work with his current work. And before I give the floor to Stefan, I hope he will also reflect with all these both speakers have said previously, whether or not this sort of very long-term risk who has been discussed or have been predicted by many scholars and experts as the war of Ukraine has happened, could have been prevented, and why shouldn't have been prevented, taking into consideration all these crises that Jonathan and Mike has been mentioning on the European level and also on institutional level, also crisis of political representation and so on and so forth. So Stefan, I also hope you will reflect something on this in your presentation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Emilija. Thank you for your kind invitation, your kind introduction. Thank you also to Julia and Elia. I'm really thrilled to be a part of this discussion. I'm just really, I regret not to be there in person. I would love to see you all in person. In fact, I can't see anyone or anything. I don't know who is in the room, but I see on the program that Professor Timothy Garton-Nash will speak in the panel after me, and I'm reminded of his visit to Hong Kong. I hosted Timothy 5 years ago. He was kind enough to defend me against the charges of being a Eurosceptic. He said I was a skeptical European, and I rather like that label. But increasingly, I'm afraid that I can't stop myself from becoming a Eurosceptic. That is one who doubts that it is even possible to change the EU for better. And there I am actually largely in agreement with Mike and his presentation at the end of history. And yet I'm coming to the EU, and my critique of the EU is informed by different considerations, particularly when it comes to Russia. I think that the threat of Putin's Russia is very real, and my worry is that the EU is actually not powerful enough to stand up to Russia. So the crude contestation, the crude argument that I want to make is that the EU has undermined both democracy in Europe and its basic security. And this is not a contradiction, unfortunately, I believe, but a mutually reinforcing tendency. And this is where I agree with Mike's criticism of Fukuyama. You see, there is nothing preordained about democracies beating the bad guys. Historically, of course, the track record of democracies has been isn't all that bad. The Western Allies defeated Nazi Germany. They did so because they were able to harness the power of their peoples the way that was superior to the power of German extreme nationalism. Now, I don't know whether the European Union is capable to live up to the current challenge. And my worry is that it undermined democracy at nation-state level and also undermined Europe's ability to defend itself. So that is why I would say that good Europeans have a problem, and the problem is called Russia. Because the track record of good Europeans on Russia and Ukraine is not all that great. But this is not surprising from the surface, right? The EU was not created to fight a war or even just to support a neighboring nation in a war. Now, rather abruptly, the EU wants to become a Schmittian sovereign. And yet it cannot become a Schmittian sovereign without abandoning its constitutional order and the values that underpin it. And this is what I try to discuss in a chapter that just came out in this edited volumes of whoever wants to unpack, need to see how to unpack that claim. I'm happy to share that chapter. So here is an apparent paradox. The European Union is no good at dealing with emergencies for reasons that Jonathan White extensively discussed over the last 10 years, right? Starting with this path-breaking study of Emergency Europe, a brilliant article from 2015. So the European Union is no good at dealing with emergencies, and yet major EU leaders seem to thrive on emergencies. Just look at how much Ursula von der Leyen shines in her role as the one who can rescue Europe. And of course, you can go back to COVID pandemic, where she was the one who offered all the solutions, or of course, more recently, the war in Ukraine. I was trying to find out whether there is any major Western leader who visited Kiev more frequently than Ursula von der Leyen. And don't get me wrong, that is perhaps where I am in conflict with Mike. I believe that Europe and the West as a whole have no alternative but to support Ukraine in order to stop Russia's imperial ambitions. But I am not convinced that the EU is the best vehicle to pursue this goal. Never mind endless talks about the EU's geopolitical moment and Europe's strategic democracy. So, like in a democracy, of course, if you declare that there are no alternatives, but to pursue this particular strategy, that's not a good starting point. So, in other words, this EU gestures do little to enhance democracy in Europe and not enough to protect Ukraine against Russia. EU leaders like Emergencies because they allow them to claim that they have reliable solutions to urgent problems. Again, that is something that Jonathan White studied extensively. So I believe that when it comes to Ukraine and its security, it was for the nation states to assist them. So, of course, this is perhaps the most unpopular person in I don't know how many people are in the room, how many people are upset even by showing the chief architect of Brexit, right, Boris Johnson. But Johnson, as the Prime Minister, was far more important to Ukraine's very survival in the first couple of days and weeks after the invasion than the entire EU. I think Volodymyr Zelensky understood that, at least to some extent. I'm just reading a brilliant biography about Zelensky that I highly recommend to everyone, and you'll find out there that Johnson was the first major foreign leader Zelensky spoke to in the UK, the first European country, of course, he visited in February last year. And yet, the same Zelensky also asked for membership of the EU on the first day of the invasion and found time to officially apply on day 4. And again, this is from that brilliant biography. So there you can read, instead of asking to be rescued, it's an extraordinary story, right? He was sitting there in the bunker and he could have been killed any moment by the Russian forces. Instead of asking to be rescued, he demanded an answer to a question Ukraine had been posing for decades. Would it ever be allowed to join the European Union? And just 4 days later, after the full-blown invasion of Ukraine started, Zelensky signed an official request for Ukraine to join the European Union. Here we see it on February 28th. Was this the right moment for it? Was there ever a right moment for it? Is this a metaphor for the unfolding Ukrainian tragedy? Instead of focusing squarely on the very survival of the nation as independent from Russia, its leaders and people supporting them fantasized about EU membership, an elusive dream that should not have been, perhaps, the government's top priority. So I don't want to downplay the EU's assistance to Ukraine. It's been very real. But what I'm suggesting is that you need to solve the Hobbesian problem of basic security first, before any promises of economic prosperity and political stability become truly realistic. So we need to solve Hobbes's problem of basic security before Lockean solutions of decent democratic order become attractive. So the problem I have with the EU is that it had enough power to anger Russia, but not enough power to protect Ukraine. And again, don't get me wrong, I'm looking at it from the perspective of someone who passionately supports the Ukrainian fight for independence. But I'm just doubtful, increasingly doubtful, whether the EU offers effective assistance. The EU tends to overpromise and underdeliver, which is the problem that I can illustrate with 2 simple images. And these are the two more slides that I want to share with you. That's pretty much all I have in terms of the pictures and the arguments. So the first picture is from February 2014, now 10 years ago. And what you can see, I use it teaching European studies to students in faraway Hong Kong, right? I ask students, what do you see, right? In the middle of the picture is the EU flag, right? And what does the EU flag represent? It's not like Ukrainians in 2014 believed that the country would be a full member of the European Union anytime soon. Remember that this was the Maidan movement, the revolution of dignity. It was about EU association agreement. So what the EU represents is the hopes for many Ukrainians for a better Ukraine that is decently governed, that is not corrupt, that is a part of Europe, a Ukraine that subscribes to Western values, democracy, the rule of law, etc. Right? So the Ukrainian flags and the EU flag. Fast forward, this is February 2022, 8 years later, just a couple of weeks before the full-blown invasion of Ukraine, and the picture is from the Verkhovna Rada, and that is the Ukrainian parliament, right? And the picture is very different. The Ukrainian flag is still there, but other than that, we see the US, the UK, Canada, the Czech Republic, Poland, even Turkey, and of course the NATO flags, right? So in the moment of need, when it was about the very survival of the nation, it is for the nation states and the key military organization that brings those nation states together, NATO, and that is where the members of Verkhovna Rada turn towards for support. So my bold claim, provocative claim, is to say that Europe failed Ukraine 10 years ago in 2014, which is when the Zeitenwende that Olaf Scholz proclaimed in February 2022, and we are still yet to see whether anything will come out of it. The Zeitenwende should have taken place in 2014. So Europe failed Ukraine 10 years ago, and it's likely to fail it again over the next 10 years or so. This is bad news, not just for the people of Ukraine, but for the European Union as a whole. And that's a strong claim. Europe has failed Ukraine. The extent of that failure is likely to be more clear in years to come. But the reasons are already discernible today. The European Union is an in-between experimental polity, and as such it did not, and it could not live up to the expectations it itself gave rise to, turning Ukraine into a thriving, prosperous and stable liberal democracy, right? The EU was not a military, is not a military actor. In fact, its emphasis on soft or smart power facilitated and accelerated the militarization of a number of its member states, including, of course, the largest, the most prosperous one, that is Germany. Related to this, Europe had little awareness of the importance of strategy. Again, that is a problem not just for the EU, but for its key member states, particularly Germany. So the EU, as an in-between polity, unwittingly reinforced Ukraine's status as an in-between country with tragic consequences. And you know that Ukraine, the word, means a kind of in-between land, at least to Russians. And finally, Europe, particularly its leading member states in the West, misapprehended the nature of the threat emanating from Russia. This is true of the collective West, but the immediate consequences of this misjudgment will be far greater in Europe than in the United States. To be sure, a failure of Ukraine will further erode the US image in the world, but Europe is much more directly affected. For Europe, the threat is existential. Where did it all go wrong? The primary culprits sit, of course, in the Kremlin. I don't want to deny that. It's Vladimir Putin and his regime. But European political leaders share that deal of responsibility too. And I don't mean merely someone like Gerhard Schröder, of course, the key proponent of the Wandel durch Handel policy that Germany pursued, that is, transformation through trade. Angela Merkel, I should remind you, was also very keen to pursue that. Timothy Snyder, perhaps the most significant historian of Ukraine, was right to say that Ukraine has no future without Europe, but Europe has also no future without Ukraine. Importantly, though, he said that in the immediate aftermath of the Maidan movement and the occupation of Crimea, so that is 10 years ago, his warning was ignored then in capitals that matter, like Berlin, Paris, and yes, even Brussels. And so were similar warnings by governments and observers in Poland. Europe should not make the same mistake again, but I think it's likely to make. Its future lies in a Europe that is more heterogeneous, more at ease with its internal differences, and more confident about its peoples, both as EU citizens and their nation states. So the dream of European sovereignty, which the likes of the French President Emmanuel Macron articulated, and the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz support, should not be pursued at the expense of Ukrainian sovereignty. Now, if I have more time, or if there is interest in the audience, I will talk about these outliers, like Hungary and Slovakia, more recently under the new Prime Minister, old new Prime Minister.
Just wondering, we're a little bit pressed for time.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I'm fine to finish on this. Thank you.
Thank
It
you.
was exactly 5 minutes. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Stefan.
Yes, I'm very sorry that Stefan cannot hear or see who is in the audience. I'm sure he will be happy to see that well-known historians we have in the audience, and history it is a very huge part of understanding what Stefan has been discussing so far, and we will discuss this in the upcoming panels. Thank you very much to Stefan for emphasizing the current situation from several perspectives, not only this new context of the end of history, but he's also reflecting in his work on the Carl Schmittian concept and understanding of legality and popular sovereignty, something that Mike also has been reflecting in his work on the legacy of the Weimar Republic, and something that also has Jonathan reflected in his work of the powerless, of the sense of the powerless coming from the citizens and from the people and from the representatives, which brings us to the question of, again, of the legal and legality and how this is legally and constitutionally organized, whether or not it is delivering the legal terms, how the rule of law works, not only in the international legal context, but also in the European and the national context. And with this said, I would also like to ask now Petr Agha, coming from the Charles University and working in the legal center of law, to reflect with some concrete examples, I hope. No? Okay. We will discuss this afterwards in the session on how this interacts, everything that has been mentioned so far. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction and also the invitation. I would also like to extend my thanks to the organizers of this event. I'm very happy to be here amongst friends and respective colleagues and also some of my intellectual heroes, so that's really a nice way of starting the conference. I am under strict orders to be short, and I don't know if I can deliver, so let's see how I succeed. Basically, my paper is a part of a project that we have with Emilija together. It's a book called Velvet Capitalism, and it's an edited volume which tries to collect different perspectives on the post-1989 developments, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, and trying to provide a different reflection of what the meaning of populism is today in Europe. And the paper I am writing, or I wrote for the book, parts of it I'm going to present today, revolves around this notion of normalcy and normality. Right? So the idea is that with the diminishing dominance, cultural dominance, and we can call it hegemony, the European Union needed to find another way of sustaining itself, and with the 30 years after 1989 and with the number of crises that the European Union has been through, this hegemonic position started crumbling, and instead European Union as a project has opted for normalizing normality of Europe. So normality had become this key political approach in terms of the governance of the European project. Now, briefly, hegemony is a well-known term, which basically for me in this paper means that it is a space which organizes and dominates specific areas of society by introducing specific logic, specific understanding, structures of meaning, and also hegemony delineates the horizon of possibility, which is an important thing for the European project as it is. Now, the primary objective of hegemony is to assert a control over society and more importantly, to eradicate social antagonisms in society by constructing cohesive social totality. And this basically was at the beginning of the European project, and this project had failed over time. Now, how do you assert hegemony as a project? Basically by legitimizing certain norms, and not just legal norms, but societal norms as well, as natural and unquestionable. And I remember, because this paper is also a bit of a personal journey of mine, in the 90s and early 2000s, Europe was something which was not really questioned. You might remember the phrases returning to Europe, growing up to democracy. So basically the dynamics between the East and the West in the European project has been that the Western Europe is something which was perfected. It is a beacon of values. It's a project. It's a blueprint for success, prosperity, democracy, rule of law. And the peripheries of the European project, the East, is there to grow up, to learn, to become democratic, and to accept these norms and to implement them. And for us at that time, that was beyond questioning for majority of those societies, because myself as well included, we had really perceived the Western model as something which was successful. Now, throughout the years, this image had crumbled, not only because of the series of crises of the European project, but also thanks to the experiences of Central and Eastern European countries. And I'm not saying here that everything was wrong, it wasn't, but it's like the feeling and the perception of there being this universally acceptable blueprint has faded in history. Now, since around 2008, with the series of crises, you see that even the European project and the European institutions themselves have started exploring alternative routes in how to sustain the European project, because there has been a lot of backlash against specific types of European policies, etc. And it was increasingly difficult to sustain this social and cultural hegemony. And instead, the European project has kind of transformed largely into what many call technocratic governance, basically, right? Technocratic governance. Mike has been talking about a lot about neoliberal policies. That also kind of includes in this, especially the Greek crisis had shown that Europe is really interested in specific areas of governance and kind of stepped away from the idea of Europe being also some sort of a broader socio-political concept. Now, instead, I would like to describe this technocratic tendencies within the European project as something, as a normalizing discourse, right? So the European project started presenting itself as a blueprint for normality. Now, hand in hand with this shift to technocratic governance is the emergence of the anti-populist discourse. Okay? So this is a concept that has been with us for about 5 years now, I think. So we have populism, populist discourse, and then we also have anti-populist discourse. This is a discourse which is deployed by European institutions, also mainstream academia, also mainstream politicians. This anti-populist discourse basically is there to combat the rise of alternative political projects, which these anti-populist tendencies label as populist and as negative. Now, at the heart of anti-populist discourse lies, in my opinion, precisely the idea of normality and normalcy. So basically, European institutions, as they stand, the blueprint that they project and defend, are presented as inevitable and universally positive. And so those who raise alternatives are labeled as abnormal, irrational people, because we have this blueprint, this discourse, which is worth defending. Now, I'm here, I'm not defending some populist strategies or policies or discourses. I'm just looking at the ability of the European Union to actually sustain itself into the future. So basically, the idea would be that instead of dealing with these issues, the European institutions are more interested in the solidification of the existing hierarchies within the European project. And again, hand in hand with this process, we need to look carefully at how the rule of law has performed within the context of establishing normalcy and how it helped building the anti-populist discourse. Now, before I touch upon the rule of law, I would like to also mention for a bit the notion of crisis. Briefly. Okay, sorry. So basically, the anti-populist discourse is largely fueled by the way the crises of the European project are portrayed and are discussed and are understood. So here we have this understanding of crisis as being something random, something external, something out of the ordinary, something that does not belong, it's not a part of the daily politics of the European project. These crises are not seen as structural failings of the project itself. They are understood more as something which comes from outside of the project, which contaminates the project, which does not belong in the project, and never as a structural part of the project itself. There, so there we see that the idea is that when a crisis emerges, we want to return to normality. Okay, it's something that we need to. It's like if a machine breaks down, so we need to replace a couple of cogs, and then we can return to normality. Now, in this crisis discourse, a huge part is played by experts, and it's the expert discourse that dictates the boundaries and the meanings of crisis. These experts, and it's the academia, it's the institutions, etc., they serve as the guardians and gatekeepers of what is normal and what is abnormal, what is irrational and what is rational. So the ability to portray specific situations as crises and the ability to present the diagnosis of the crisis has been a crucial part of establishing normality within the European project. So we see a shift from, let's say, political contestation, not only to European institutions, technocracy, But we also see how these institutions deploy the discourse of expertocracy to further sustain and support the existing power structures in the European project. So the structural problems of the European project get to be labeled as crises, as abnormal occurrences. Yeah, okay, I can wrap it up. Okay, so yeah, this is a difficult situation. So basically the takeaway from my talk, which is interrupted by the lack of time, is that at the heart of the current European project is the crisis discourse. The crisis discourse basically helps sustaining the existing power structures, helps solidifying the existing power structures, also gives meaning to the technocratic and post-political phase of the European project, and helps to avoid structural reforms that are very badly needed in the European project vis-à-vis the center-periphery, the east and west dynamics that we have in Europe. And I apologize for slightly confusing presentation, but I try to meet the needs of the panel. Thank you for your presentation.